Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to Red Light Exposé podcast. This episode is part of our Men for Equality series, where we highlight the voices of 8 men who are doing important work that supports the movement to end commercial sexual exploitation. These men are survivor activists, policy advisors, and passionate changemakers. Red Light Exposé thanks Empower Men for their generosity in helping to make this series possible. You can check out and support the great work they are doing on their website, empowermen.ca. And now to the episode.
Hi, a very warm welcome to everyone tuning in. My name is Michelle Abel, and I'm a survivor of familial trafficking and abuse. I'm one of the co-hosts here at Red Light Exposé. I'm joining you today from Canada, where I reside, and I'm so excited for the conversation that I'll be having with a really remarkable guest. Marcel Van Der Watt holds a doctorate in philosophy and is the president of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation in Washington, D.C. He is an internationally acclaimed investigative professional with over 22 years of experience in combating the interconnected criminal economies of organized crime, human trafficking, and sexual exploitation. His extensive background as a former police investigator, hostage and suicide negotiator, and human trafficking case consultant continues to inform his work. Marcel has consulted on and provided expert court testimony in several sex trafficking cases, briefed members of the U.S. Congress on issues related to online criminality, and engaged with both the presidency and multi-party Women's Caucus in South Africa's parliament on matters related to implicit harms, myths, and laws associated with the sex trade. His work has been published and presented on international platforms, and he has trained multidisciplinary professionals from more than 30 countries. Marcel is also a research fellow at the Free State Center for Human Rights at the University of the Free State in South Africa. So welcome, Marcel. We are so happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for the work that you and Andrea and the rest of the team are doing.
Thank you. So, well, wow, what an impressive resume, I've got to say. I don't know exactly where to begin, but your expertise crosses so many areas, and it's clear that you're really passionate about justice in general, but also getting justice for the victims of horrific crimes such as human trafficking. So I want to say thank you for your service to the community and acknowledge how difficult this work is, but also how important it is to have men who have taken up this kind of work for the well-being of our communities. Perhaps a good place to start is to describe the work that you're doing at NCOSI, both individually and as an organization.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm currently, leading the organization in my role as president here at NCOSI, and our work spans multiple strategies and tactics that we employ, and ultimately it's about untangling this web of sexual exploitation. And we've been in existence for more than 60 years, and through our work over that period, we've come to realize that it truly is a web, and that none of these issues exists in its own private universes, so from sex trafficking, prostitution, pornography, this new mercurial issue related to artificial intelligence and image-based sexual abuse, all of these things intersperse. Our main focus is the mass scale prevention of sexual abuse and exploitation. And therefore, we are focused on systems, systems of systems of systems that enable and perpetuate these. And we have distinct strategies, and we use public policy, civil litigation, corporate advocacy. And then we also have a parent center that we will launch later this year. And all of this is undergirded by research. So there's definitely an evidence-based approach that we take to this. But we are involved with consulting with law enforcement and prosecutors pretty much across the globe. And in 2 weeks' time, I will be testifying in another case in South Africa. It's really great and really a pleasure and an honor to have your ear in these different dimensions to the issues that we deal with. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do here at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation.
That's really impressive and really great work that NCOSI is doing. And we're so grateful for this organization and the role that you play in it. It seems like it's just a vast amount of different hats that you wear within the organization, correct?
All of us here at NCOSI, we are nudged to wear different hats. We are small teams. So, yep, that's correct, Michelle.
Turning more to you as an individual, I'd love to hear more about your upbringing and your life experiences in South Africa. And I'm also wondering if living through the apartheid influenced you in specific ways that perhaps resulted in your career path and your choices. So, could you talk to us a bit about that?
Absolutely. I so love and appreciate that question. So, yes, I grew up in the midst of apartheid. So my dad was in the security forces, was a government official. So obviously, he was part of the vanguard of all things that happened in the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s. So I saw a lot of that. I experienced, albeit from observing these injustices. It was in my midst. I was in the arena. Always looked up to my dad as the policeman, and he was a very, very proud policeman. And I have to say that the scales pretty much fell from his eyes many years later. I would say on or about 1998, 1999, when I just left school, and I started asking much deeper questions about life and justice and right and wrong. And, we started having conversations, and retrospectively, I asked a lot of questions, and all of this crescendoed when I entered the police and I started studying, and I learned more about human rights and dignity and human flourishing. And hindsight is always 2020. And then looking back, you realize how acutely vulnerable just so many people in South African society was and continue to be, and how that just predisposes people and humanity to the worst of things from a vulnerability perspective. So that is the era in which I grew up. I am a follower of Christ. I am very unequivocal about my faith, and that's what just contributes to the conviction and the certitude in terms of why what we see around us is not normal, should not be tolerated. And, as obviously me as a follower of Christ, but also just as reasonable people who ought to know better, we are all called to respond to what we see, and our convictions. That was South Africa, and that's where I became a policeman. I spent about 10 years in the South African Police Services, where I immediately, it was in June 2002, where I, for the first time, being confronted with all things the sex trade, one of the first experiences in June 2002 was going into a brothel. There was some allegation of rape, sexual offenses happening. And that's where I, for the first time, confronted with the cries of somebody. This woman was barely an adult, just being gang raped, and understanding what a brothel looks like, what happens in there. And I think right from the outset, the issue of demand and the fact that this exists because of men, and overwhelmingly men, by the way, purchasing sexual access to women and children. So it dates back to those days, and then everything else followed, working with children, missing persons, missing people. And eventually, one of the cases that I investigated just kind of exploded in the media. I got a lot of airtime on TV and on radio. And through that exposure, you have just swaths of people approaching you with new information and insights. So it's just been, it's pretty much became a snowball effect of just being increasingly immersed in all of these things. Then joined academia, just ran all the hoops of academic work, and then just seeing then how my own lived experiences in the field complements the research that I subsequently did, and just gave me exposure to all of these political undercurrents, ideologies, obscure agendas that is fused with all things the sex trade and research, etc. So it's been an interesting journey, and obviously, I knew about the work here of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation dating back to 2016, and so I was just fortunate to join the team here, and so it's been 23 years and bringing all to this work.
Thank you so much for that. You have such a deep respect for your father and a love and admiration, and that really comes through. And obviously, he was a great role model in your life. But equally to that, I'm touched by the fact that you speak about your faith, because I am a woman of faith as well. And we know that even through our difficulties, we are able to rely on our faith and gain strength, especially in some of the most horrific things that we endured, but also in my work, in my advocacy work. And it's very grounding, faith when you have something that you can rely on.
Absolutely. And it's also just liberating in the sense that when we deal with these deep and dark matters that sometimes just feels dystopian, it's liberating to know that it's not my responsibility to fix all of this and to change the world. It's, we are called to show up and do the best we can possibly do with what we have, but it's ultimately, we are part of a larger plan, and we are part of the dream and not the nightmare. So in that way, I do feel that weight taken off my shoulder, because there was a time when I felt like, man, I am responsible to fix all of this and I need to come up with all the answers. And that's just not the case. Part of that is, and why it's important, is because vicarious trauma and burnout is so real in the space. It's life-giving and it's rejuvenating knowing that, I am on this journey with my Heavenly Father. So, yep.
That's wonderful. And thank you. Thank you for sharing this.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
So could you tell our listeners your opinions on the relationship between porn consumption, sexual exploitation, and human trafficking? I'd really love for you to express some of your opinions based on your work and your experiences?
Great question. I think it's inextricably linked. If you see how these cases, how it germinates and how it originates and how it manifests throughout society, it's, the one often informs the other. There's very, very, very clear research about pornography consumption. We know it has a very, very real impact on the brain and how people view society, view people. The more is consumed, the more it kind of needs to be consumed, and there's often this escalation in the nature of the content just becomes more and more. It's just this deterioration in the kind of content that's being consumed, and there's also correlation with aggression and acting out in terms of what people see. I mean, I just always, there's obviously this fusion between good research and experience, and I've just seen so many times in my career also involved with issues related to serial sexual offenses, whether it's serial rape or other kinds of crimes, where pornography is just this constant feature. I know when I've done asymmetrical police investigations, when I went into place of exploitation, most of the times there was always pornography on the set, on the scene, or pornography that's actively playing as men enters these premises. And then also the requests, not requests, but actions being perpetrated against people in prostitution, even issues like coprophilia and europhilia, and a lot of these things, people see these things on pornography and they act out that what they view on real people. And in sex trafficking, we also know that pornography is often the script that sex buyers tap into to act out, and very often people is also being trafficked for pornography. So again, I think the residue and the DNA of pornography, sex buying, sex trafficking, I would even say organized crime, it's all fused. So trying to make an argument that all of these exist in their own little clinical lanes, it's just false. It doesn't happen like that. It's important for people out there that do consume pornography to understand that you are inevitably part of the problem. Your fingerprints, your mark is left on this system of sexual exploitation. So I think the more that awareness becomes visceral to people, the more people realize that, listen, there is the system where these things all fuse.
Yes, I would agree with you. And I think there's a mindset generally that people think that prostitution, pornography, they operate in silos. But it's so evident to us doing this work that it's all interlinked. And so often we really don't put that together. If someone's going through pornography or hooked on pornography, we don't always look at what led up to that. I think often we just tend to see things in tunnel vision almost.
And many times it's just pretty much in some ways intellectual comfort, but it also just gives us the illusion of control, that we can control the narrative and we can control in some way our conscience, because ultimately I think it's intuitive. I think it's intuitive that these things are interconnected, but being able to separate them and putting them in different boxes, it helps keep intact that very real consciousness that what I'm doing, what I'm involved in is inherently harmful. And it's got very real physical, sexual, psychological harms that I am ultimately complicit in. In many ways, how people then craft these little boxes within which they can designate specific choices, and again, the illusion of control and being able to manage that. But you're right, just with your background and your own experiences, Michelle, these are the insights and the voices that we need to hear. And unfortunately, they are not elevated the way they should. So yeah, just thank you for your voice and your experiences. These are very important to hear.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate that. And yes, it's very difficult in trying to speak up and trying to convey aspects of your abuse to make it impactful. I think so many times people get hooked on the story, but they don't realize what the message is there that, survivors or people dedicated to doing this work that we're trying to bring forth. And that can be a complex situation at times. And one of the things I was thinking about as you was expressing this was what is very disturbing to me, and I'm sure with your background as well, is that we're seeing younger and younger perpetrators. And I would really love to have your thoughts on that and the impacts that is having on society as a whole.
Yeah. Great question, Michelle. I mean, by now it's common knowledge that exposure to pornography, it's just people at a very young age become exposed to pornography and it's got intergenerational implications. I thought about this a while back. There was a lot of stuff going on at some point where parents would take their children to some of these shows and have naked people walking down the streets and children are present and parents are giving the kids money and the kids would transfer and give that money to these half naked men dressed up in some of them in all kinds of costumes. This became very evident about 2-3 years ago. And I thought to myself, the ages of these parents, they were likely the 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 year olds in 2004, 2005, when internet pornography exploded. And I think the chickens are coming home to roost, where you now have these adults and the normalization of the content, just part of the way that people interpret and live life. And a lot of this has been informed by pornography. So there is this indifference that we see is becoming increasingly systemic in society. And I think pornography has a very big part to play in that. And again, those kids are also growing up. Child on child sexual abuse is very real, it's very pervasive. And very unfortunately, it doesn't stay on as a child on child sexual abuse. These kids turn adults and they perpetrate as adults. And that's why we focus here on mass scale prevention and thinking about the systems and the pornography industry as a system that is incredibly harmful. And now we also see how that fuses with so many other phenomena, the internet. And we talk in the United States, we talk about CDA 230, the Communications and Decency Act 230, that really just gives immunity to these big technology platforms to host some of this material. And just the guardrails that entirely falls off. And then you've got organized criminal syndicates and they tap into that. And then you've got sextortion, where you've got teenagers, 15, 16, 17 years old. They meet a young girl online, they exchange nudes. And the next moment, it's not a young girl, it's a criminal sitting elsewhere in the world and is now demanding 3, 4, 5,000 US dollars to be paid. Otherwise, this content will be made known. And then, you've got a trend within 20, 30 minutes. Some of these kids die by suicide. So it's incredibly sad and it should embolden all of us to say, but we cannot tolerate this any longer. We need accountability and big technology companies are part of the problem.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And we see also the distortion of sexuality. And I think a lot of children really struggle with who they are, what is their sexuality, what is their role. And it causes mass confusion because, as we both know, a person's brain isn't fully developed until their 20s. So imagine that a child being exposed to all this information, they really are going to struggle and have like deep rooted trauma within them that they will carry throughout their lifetime unless they really get the support and help that they need. I'm curious about what sort of conversations do you think parents and caregivers alike could have to address the perhaps unrealistic expectations that porn creates?
I think the first thing is just starts on a relational basis is you can't even begin to have those conversations if there's not relational proximity with children and with loved ones, whether it's a 6 year old and whether it's a 16-year-old. It's also the awareness, not just the awareness, but the cognizance and the understanding of how incredibly harmful not just the issue of pornography is, exposure to pornography, I think just by general media where sexual objectification is just so rife and it's so pervasive, and how that acutely informs how children, teens, preteens view themselves and view others. And I think that's why we do need those leaders in the household, the sober voice, the mother, the father, to help children understand that their value is not woven into what media portray and what people think. Their value it transcends far more than that. But it starts with that love and relational proximity and helping people, young children, see beyond the internet, beyond the screens and scrolling to death, literally. So I think that's where it starts, and it's personifying what does dignity and respect look like on a one-on-one level. And I think fathers, mothers, brothers, teachers, clergy, if you want to refer anybody in a position of power, has the opportunity to be ambassadors of those things, and but also being the antithesis to what mainstream culture teaches, because these are lies and these are fleeting promises and they always disappoint. I always say to people, pornography never loves you back. It just carves out an increasingly larger whole. And ultimately, for parents and caregivers, if we are not the ones that stand in that gap, something else is eventually going to fill that. And it's very likely going to be the next diet of pornography. I do think it's a systemic problem, but it's going to require a systemic response. I've always used this example when investigating organized crime or training others to investigate it. It's you ultimately need to create a system that looks remarkably similar to the one that you're trying to confront. And what does that look like? It's the antithesis, but it looks similar because it's equally agile, it's equally responsive to an opportunity, it's equally responsive to accountability or the lack thereof. So what does it look like, and how do we create those systems in our household, but also in the community, in the school, that confronts and in some ways mimics the tactics that's used by the harmful system, but mimicking it in such a way that really creates a hostile environment for the system of pornography and commodification to find its foothold. We all, as responsible adults, we've got an enormous role to play to bring about a system and a culture that is hostile to these things, that is harming.
I would really love for you to touch on who is the biggest offender in the industry, and maybe you can speak a little bit about them and how they operate. And I will certainly share a little bit about my knowledge regarding that entity, but I'll let you start off.
There's always the giants out there, and I think there's a spectrum of complicity, and some of them are official, some of them are more on the darker side of just carelessness. If you just think about PornHub and the way that organization has been exposed in the recent, I think a lot of this started back in 2018, 2019, and we know the work of Lila has just been doing phenomenal work in this space. But it's just mind-boggling how that company was able to continue operating with absolute impunity and with no compunction for so many years. Just the rape themes, incest. It's just some of the most dystopian content that has been hosted and been monetized on that platform. I think it's going to be it is a stain on humanity, and it's going to be for a very long time. The fact that good people knew what was going on and pretty much just remained neutral for a very long time, and that it just really came down to a small group of individuals and organizations that said, no, this is not normal. We should not be tolerating that. On a different kind of sphere, if we just think about Meta, I was in the room in January 31 last year when Mark Zuckerberg turned around and apologized to all the parents. But just what is happening on that platform, and that it's almost this constant mercurial attempt to see where the gaps are, and it's always putting profit above the safety of children. Always all about profit. The same thing with PornHub, whether it's PornHub or Meta or whether it's some of these other companies. It's just unacceptable. And I think it's time that these companies are being held accountable, fully held accountable. And I think to the point that is made by Senator Josh Hawley in Congress just around the corner here, the thing that these companies fear most is parents being able to sue and civil litigation. And I think that's going to happen. It's around the corner. There's a lot of good things happening. There's a lot of good acts coming down the pike. I'm going to be at the White House on Monday as the president and the first lady sign the Take It Down Act. So there's a lot of good things happening, and we've come a long way, but accountability is so important and recourse is so important, especially when people were harmed.
Yes. We're going to touch a little bit about Pornhub and them claiming that they weren't a Canadian company, but yet we know that they are located in Montreal, Canada, and they've been able to operate in such a way due to their tax structure. You can question whether or not they really are a Canadian corporation, but when you look at structure, it comes right back to Canada. What are your opinions on why Canada isn't taking a more active role to ensure the protections of people on this site?
I can't speak with authority in terms of wittingly, unwittingly, Canada not making a concerted effort to do something about porno, but clearly there's a lack of action, and clearly there is just this apparent indifference in terms of not holding them accountable. But I do, and this is unfortunately, but I do think politics and ideologies has played into the mumness of role players or country. And the issue of pornography, historically, it's well documented that from an ideological perspective, it's always been aligned with the idea of progressive thought, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And that it's unfortunate that you often have these human rights labels that takes precedence over any conversation around harm and violence, and effectively even the loss of life. When we think about the examples out there of content not being removed and periphery to that issue of sextortion, it's very unfortunate that our priorities is just simply not at the right place, especially if we are willing to compromise on the very, very real issues of dignity and sexual dignity. And we use these highfalutin arguments, freedom of speech and these rights that we claim, and that taking precedent over the very real safety of people. So in terms of why Canada is just moving so slowly, it's just unfortunate. The optics of it all is really not good, and it leaves more questions than answers. I think in this respect is one example where the answer is easy, but I think it's important for people like yourself, Michelle, and just so many people on the Canadian side, just to say, but listen, one of the government's cornerstone responsibilities is to keep its citizens safe. And part of keeping citizenry safe is making sure that any risk of harm is not just mitigated, but if you can actually do something about this, that should be your foremost priority.
Yes. And there are many Canadian organizations and advocates that are fighting to have that change and have our government hold them responsible. But it is a fight, as you're aware. And often, because I do frontline work as well and dealing with victims, what we hear is, why isn't Canada doing what the US is doing? So that's really always a challenge to answer that, because ultimately victims and survivors alike want justice. It's that mindset that we have that we're not having that given to us.
Yeah, and when you do have that active citizenry and having absolute access to people in power and really holding them accountable and calling them out, diplomacy only goes so far. And you can be political without being political, and tact is the art of making a point without making an enemy. But at the end of the day, if this has very real world implications on dignity and just the safety of people, I do think that there's room to just double down on efforts and just to, hold your policymakers, leaders, holding their feet to the fire, proverbially speaking. And unfortunately, the blameworthiness of our decision makers and of our leaders just simply increases every day that goes by where a policy decision or an action is absent. The blameworthiness is not going away, it's increasing. And again, it's not going to disappear. So I think it's important to help people understand and help reconcile the idea that this absence of action, it's going to come back, and it's just really not going to be a good legacy that we leave behind for our people and generations.
This leads me into wanting you to really delve into what Section 230 is. And I would really love for our listeners to know what that entails and how have these platforms like Meta, like Pornhub, been able to hide, maybe for lack of a better expression, but to operate under this section.
The very foundation of our online society, the Communications Decency Act in 230, Section 230, it was created in the very, very early days of the internet in 1996. Totally, obviously, unaware about what's coming down the pike. It's been 30 years now, and the online environment looks very different from what it did in 1996. And it's really become totally disconnected from the real world. So the cracks have now become chasms. One seemed to be necessary legislation that underpins for online businesses to thrive now stands really as the greatest shield of technology companies from any and all accountability. So the Section 230 really predates social media. It predates smartphones and the modern internet. And back in the day, it governed only about 20 million American users and not today's 300 million American users. What it did not take into account back in the day is how perpetrators and how platforms can misuse technology to enable, wittingly, unwittingly, things that we see now: sexual abuse, the rise of deepfake technology, the widespread application of artificial intelligence. These are all cracks, and there's very real people that are falling through it. But it's CDA 230, it's now for the first year, it's been the only target on our Dirty Dozen list. COSI, every year we have our Dirty Dozen list of 12 companies that enable and perpetuate sexual exploitation. CDA 230 is such a big problem that we have listed CDA 230 as taking up the position on each one of those 12 positions on the Dirty Dozen list. So yeah, it's a very real issue, and it needs to change, because ultimately you've got big tech companies that are shielded by CDA 230. We now have some interim or some laws that the one is going to be signed on Monday. That's the Take It Down Act, which I referred to earlier, where if harmful content appears on these platforms, one of the requirements of the Take It Down Act is that content needs to be removed within 48 hours. But from a systems perspective, CDA 230 needs to be repealed, and we're going to have to rethink how we do this going forward. So it's actually a shield that has become a very big weapon for big tech companies.
Yes, and I'm really happy about the Take It Down Act, but several of the bills that are being proposed right now, once they're passed into law, I'd like you to just address some of that. And what are you most passionate about, the bills that are coming forth?
So a massive victory is the Take It Down Act, and that's going to be signed on this coming Monday. But then there's also the COSA Act, which is the Kids Online Safety Act. And basically what that comes down to is it's going to require common safe settings to be automatically turned on for children on all products, technology products that big tech companies create. So common sense safety settings automatically turned on for children. It also establishes a legally actionable duty of care for platforms that are likely to be accessed by minors. It also requires platforms to provide safeguards and tools for parents and guardians to protect their children, and ultimately transparency so that companies can and must disclose their policies and practices around the use of personal data and the data of minors. We're very excited about the COSA Act, and we truly believe it will come to pass this year. We truly believe that. There's also the App Store Accountability Act that we are really excited and passionate about. And really what that comes down to, the App Store Accountability Act would really, there's key safety measures. The first one is parental consent required for users under ages of 18. So the App Store Accountability Act mandates that app stores obtain parental consent when minors are attempting to download apps and make in-app purchases. It also requires app developers to provide accurate age ratings. Michelle, there's been kissing apps is one of them. No age restriction, or some of them young as 4-year-old age restrictions where you can actually purchase a kissing app. So with the COSA or with the App Store Accountability Act, app developers will have to provide accurate age ratings. And then the third one there is app stores will need to verify the age of users before permitting downloads. So these are all arrows in our collective quiver to bring about a safer digital environment for children, but ultimately also just holding developers, app developers, big tech companies accountable for this. And just we saying no longer can you prioritize profit over children's safety.
Yes, and one of the major difficulties, as you touched on before, and in doing this work as well, is the privacy issues. And they're able to maneuver and hide or operate their privacy protections in various countries, because it's not just in North America that the work is reaching, but it's global. What are your opinions about the privacy concerns and how maybe they're a hindrance in getting these various laws passed? What actions would need to be taken in order for these laws to be implemented, irregardless to the privacy concerns?
That's also a great question. And obviously we've also part of the whole age verification case, the case of the Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. The decision is forthcoming any moment now in the US Supreme Court. The privacy issue has always been just one of those concerns that has been raised. And I think all of these briefs that's been submitted for the Supreme Court matter, each and every one of them has really debunked the whole privacy retort largely from the pornography industry. And our position is age verification is not a threat to privacy. Rather, the real threat to privacy is the pornography industry itself. And obviously, we lay out the arguments in this brief. And I think a lot of these are just the pornography industry playing for time. It's distractions. And ultimately, the argument for privacy, it just deprioritizes entirely the very real safety concerns that there are for children and the uploading of material of people that has never been questioned how valid and how legit it is. And that's why we have a situation that we have at the moment. It's just entire system of indifference where abuse content is just so pervasive and questions has never been asked. And now the questions are being asked. Age verification is the key to making the internet safer for children, but also protecting people against issues like image-based sexual abuse and the pornography industry. So yeah, privacy and has just been one of those key concerns raised by the pornography industry.
Yes, absolutely. Is there a special strength or skill that you believe men can uniquely bring to this movement, Marcel?
We spoke earlier on, Michelle, about my dad, and I will never forget. I was at a birthday party at the age of, man, I was probably about 9 or 10 years old, and I was just one of the few boys there, and then the last other boy left, and I was there with my parents. My brother was still very young. And there was just a bunch of girls, and they were doing their thing, and I was doing my thing. And I'll never forget, just one of the girls just started, you know how kids are, just started teasing you. I can't even remember what it was. I can't remember it was because I was wearing glasses or something. But I was like in a corner, and they were just laughing and teasing me. So what I did, I just ran past them, but I bumped them like out of the way. Like I just wanted to run away from them. And I bumped one or two of the girls out of the way. And my dad saw this, and he was like, "You never, ever do that in your life again." And I vividly remember my dad never a harsh word towards my mom, never ever raised, even remotely raised his hand towards my mom. And I never saw that kind of behavior in the marriage between my mom and my dad. And that day, I vividly remember that day when my dad took me aside and he spoke to me and he said, "You never do that again. Never do you either raise your hand or any form of physical violence against somebody of the other sex." And in this case, it was young girls. I was of equal age. They were my peers. But that message stayed with me for the rest of my life. And I'm eternally grateful because that came at a tender age. And I think for men, fathers, teachers, sports coaches, that's the age during which we want to impact the youth. We, especially young boys, if we think about the developmental stages, if we think about the ages of 7 to 14 years, I always think about that period, 7 years between 7 and 14. It's such a crucial time to imbue knowledge, to create these guardrails and pivot points that young children pick up and they learn. And more often than not, that really stays with people, as this lesson from my dad stays with me to this day. And it's really also been part of how I do my work and why I've always been or had an affinity for work related to women and children. One thing that comes to mind is making that impact as young as possible as leaders, as men. And what does masculinity really means? Doesn't mean what Andrew and Tristan Tate teaches us about masculinity. It's absolutely the antithesis to that. And there you have two, what appears to be very secure and macho men, deeply insecure and unmacho men. And I think it's for reasonable people and men to stand into that gap and to say, we do not have to have media, pornography, and the Tates dictate to us what masculinity is, because it's false, it's not true. And the sooner we can reach young boys, young men with that message, the better.
I absolutely agree with you. And the importance, even as a survivor, the importance of good men nurturing us, supporting us, standing with us, and having those values, it just really helps to heal us. And I know that there are many are of the opinion that have been abused that perhaps believe that they don't need men in the healing aspect of things, but I absolutely think we do. It helps us to let go of some of the horrific things that happen. And when you actually have someone that cares about you and can actually not just heal your heart or your trauma, but heal your spirit. That is so important. And I wonder, what is the role you envision for men as agents of change? What are your thoughts around that? How can men really step up and be what women need them to be, children need them to be in our lives. As you explained about the great memories with your dad and your mom and never seeing anything negative within their relationship.
Great question, and thank you for that, Michelle. I just want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. Is also men need to hear what you've shared as somebody that has been affected and been harmed by men and these phenomena and crime. So it's also important for men to hear that. And I think part of, from a societal systems perspective, again, is how do we create a response system where we hear these voices like yours and Andrea's and what Andrea has experienced, and for men to be given the opportunity and maybe nudged to learn from your perspective. But I don't think that society is set up that way. Unfortunately, the structures in society, it's totally inclined to further this very harmful narrative of, at times, rape myths, sexual objectification. So it's an entire overhaul that is needed, and men is often at the helm of very big companies, corporate companies, media companies that partake in the furtherance of these very harmful narratives. So I think it's men, all levels of society, and I think it's going to start with people that's already within our midst, people that men that you trust and that you work with, people like me that needs to be very active and proactive in having conversations, drawing people in and destigmatizing. It's not a sign of weakness to be able to have a conversation as a man with another man and saying, you know what, pornography, it's not what you really think it is. There's actually more to it, and it's not a pretty picture. It's and helping men understand that their complicity in the bigger scheme of harm, but it should not be a conversation that relies on shame. Shame, it doesn't work. And I think it's more conversation about very real conversations between men, helping men understand that just by virtue of standing up and being an ally, you don't yet have to articulate your position. It's just showing up with me as a fellow man, being an ally, being in the room where just your presence means you are an ally to this message of dignity and the fact that we can move the needle. And the movement of the needle is really going to require of all of us, all men, whether it's conversations in the elevator, conversations in the locker room, conversations in the boardroom. So often we see men and the male gaze openly and sometimes without any compunction in a public space look at women in pretty much and just entirely in an inappropriate manner. So there I see my role as actively and sometimes discreetly in a public setting, nudging and saying, but you know what? This is not how we do. This is not how we interact. Might not be verbal, but what you do and how you gaze, it is just inappropriate. There's a way that you can go about having conversations like those. It's going to be uncomfortable conversations, but nothing meaningful has ever been achieved through comfort. So it's gonna be like a muscle that we train. It's a reconfiguration, a recalibration about how we as men interact, socially interact as men, but also in the midst of other people and women. It's going to have to be a campaign, Michelle. And I think in our granular day-to-day life, I try to do that. I know many other men is trying to do that. You've got so many amazing people in Canada, men there that's standing up and that's saying not an hour watch. And they're leading conversations about why men should not be purchasing sexual access to women and children. And those should be the stories we tell. Those should be the men that we elevate instead of the Andrew and Tristan Tates of this world. So again, a recalibration of what is culturally nice to do. It's an entire systems approach that's going to have to change.
Yes, and I think what comes to mind is that men have been brought up and conditioned to be so stoic and not show emotion. And I think that really needs to change in moving forward, in really doing this work and standing with us and helping us to heal.
Martin Luther King, I think one of his quotes is, "I cannot be what I'm supposed to be if you're not what you're supposed to be." He talks about that as the integrated structure of reality. And I remember at one time, my wife and I, we read this book many years ago, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And it's just great conversations to be had. And I think it's through opening ourselves up to these conversations that doesn't come naturally, but being able as men to just show up and just allow yourself to be open to a different perspective, and knowing and believing that it's really the sum total of these conversations from which something really special, meaningful, and dignified can emerge. So it's conversations. We are relational human beings. So these changes are not going to happen at the back of a screen. It's going to actually require very real interactions. So we are beyond the COVID years. We know what happened during COVID with pornography consumption and harm and abuse. We are beyond that. So these conversations should be had offline in conference rooms, at the breakfast table. So there's a huge opportunity for the next generation of male leadership to step up and saying, I'm going to make this as a part of the DNA of the company that I'm running, of the sports team I'm coaching. It might be a team leading a hockey, a soccer, rugby, or football team. We should instill the desire in young boys to embrace these meaning systems and a different perspective on what it means to be a leader, and inculcate that in their leadership from as young as school going ages. So I think democratizing that courage, because I think there's a lack of courage. So democratizing it and saying to men, listen, you can be courageous, you can be outspoken about this issue.
Wow, that is so powerful. Thank you very much for sharing. So impactful. Just really great. Is there anything that you'd like to share more with our listeners before we leave you? I'd just like to give you the opportunity to send a message. What would your message be, or how would you like to leave our listeners today?
I'm just eternally grateful for you. You are making an impact, and it really reverberates, I promise you, throughout the globe. I remember, I've been doing work in North America for many years already, but I only came to the States in 2020. But I vividly remember, even over the last 5 years, Andrea on social media, there's many other leaders out there. People read, people listen, people observe. So never, ever underestimate just how impactful your voices are. But then there's also this book that we are busy writing now. I think the area where the battle of ideas and ideologies and philosophies are lost by the dignity community. I'm talking of the dignity community, the abolitionist community, those of us who really hold on to these abolitionist principles. Where this is lost is academia. Scholars are, unfortunately, philosophically, ideologically, or just from a career perspective, disincentivized to engage in this research from a true, honest, methodological perspective. I've seen scholars over the years, especially prostitution research, etc., and how research are done is they would go to I'm speaking metaphorically now, right? So they would take an arrow, a flaming arrow, and they would aim the flaming arrow at a blank wall, and then they would shoot the arrow, and the arrow is pinned with a flame into the blank wall, and then they would walk over and they would take a little Sharpie or a Koki pen, and they would draw a circle around the arrow and say, see, we hit the mark. And that's often how the research goes, is the findings comes first, and then they look for the evidence to support the findings. It's fundamentally flawed research. So we will be exposing a lot of that coming down the pike here at Nkosi. But 2 projects, and then I'll get to the book one. But the first one is we've got a special issue, a scholarly special issue for the journal Trends in Organized Crime. There's never yet before has there been a special issue in a reputable academic journal that focuses on demand. And this one is entitled The Special Issue: Sex Buyers, Sex Trafficking, and Organized Crime. So me and John Winterdijk from Canada, we are editing that one, but it's really moving beyond the idea that sex buyers only their dollars are only find itself back into the sex trade. I've worked with cases around the world where sex buyer dollars funds terrorism, funds corruption, money laundering, all property crime, retail crime, and how the sex buyer dollars funds criminal syndicates, and those syndicates, and obviously they've got different channels of stuff that they're involved in. So that special issue is coming down the pike. We've got phenomenal articles coming that we will be publishing that one. But then there's also the book, and the working title for the book is The New Abolitionism and Sexual Exploitation. So it's really thinking about what abolitionism meant a few hundred years ago and rethinking its meaning and its purpose in modern day society. So Andrea is already part of that book. Very grateful for Andrea's participation there. And Michelle, we'll reach out to you. And it's nascent. We just started this off about 3-4 weeks ago, but it's going well. And hopefully, God willing, we'll have a special issue on demand reduction and a book on abolitionism coming down the pike. And we just believe it's just two very important arrows in our collective quiver for a better world. Dignity, free from sexual abuse and exploitation.
That's really exciting. That's great. I would love to be able to contribute to that book. So I'm really excited about that. And it's great that Andrea is already part of this. So it's tremendous. But Marcel, this has been really great to spend this time with you. It's been so enlightening. And thank you so much for speaking from your heart. I really want to thank you for being here with me today and giving us your time, sharing so much wealth through your knowledge and insights. The work you are doing is tremendously important and so impactful on the lives of those you serve. I know I speak for many survivors in saying that men like you give us hope that there are caring, thoughtful, supportive men who want to stand beside victims and survivors and walk alongside us in the pursuit of our justice and our healing journey. So thank you so very much for spending this time with us.
Thank you, Michelle. And just thank you for your life and your voice and giving me the inspiration and the courage to continue doing what I try to do and hope to achieve here with the rest of our team. So thank you just for your unmissable role in all of this.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcel, for your time. Greatly appreciate it.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.